other projects which I'd like to touch on. So one of these is the cryopreservation of organs. So
Yeah,
can
we
you?
actually have we
Yeah.
actually have a few other projects. I think the reason why you said there were two is because you're restricting your description to what we're doing in research. But we have a couple of other projects which are very much in the outreach realm. Of course, I've always been quite involved in outreach, but we're putting a considerably higher proportion of our budget at LEVF into outreach than what we ever did at SRF. And that's really because the time has come when it's more, people are more receptive. So we have two entities that we are supporting. One of them is called the Alliance for Longevity Initiatives, which is a lobbying group, a 501c4 as it's called in the US, and they interface very energetically with Congress, and they're trying to educate elected representatives, change how the laws are written. There's already been a small success there, which was to change the regulations that the FDA have about the nature of preclinical work, animal work, that needs to be done in order for a clinical trial to be approved. Essentially, beforehand, it said it's got to be actual animals, and now it says that it doesn't have to be animals. You can use organs on a chip, or organoids, other things like that. So it's kind of been modernized, if you like, and that was partly due to this organization. The other one is a grassroots organization, really with the same kind of audience as the AARP. In other words, basically, the older generation. And I call it the antidote to the AARP because basically the idea is to represent and to fight for the rights of the elderly, but to do so from a medical perspective in a manner that's actually based on hope rather than on fatalism and the belief that aging is inevitable and so on. So that's the Healthspan Action Coalition, as they're called. And those two projects are very important to us, so that's why we're giving them substantial funding. But on the research side, yes, we do have a couple of other projects. One of them I can't say much about right now because it's very exploratory. That's the one involving the development of perfusates to rejuvenate organs before transplantation. But the other one I can talk a lot about because I've been working with that group for quite a long time. It's a company called Keinice, Keinice, and it's a kind of reboot of a previous company called Arigos, Arigos. Both companies were headed by a wonderful, wonderful pioneer named Tanya Jones, who has been involved in cryopreservation and cryonics for upwards of 20 years. And at one point, she was my chief operating officer at SENS Research Foundation. And the technology that they are pursuing is a way to cool organs, solid organs, very, very much faster than you can do today. And the way they do that is by pumping cold gas through the vasculature of the organ. Very cold gas, obviously. There's a concept called persuflation, P-E-R-S-U-F-F-lation. And the big innovation that Keinice have is that the gas they're using is helium. This is very, very superior, partly because it doesn't dissolve. It's got a very low solubility in water. Which is good for not getting the bends, basically. The other big thing about helium is that, of course, it stays gaseous all the way down to liquid nitrogen temperatures, which is handy. But yeah, this means by this kind of method you can cool at least 10 times as fast as you can if you're just cooling from the surface. And that matters a huge amount for cryopreservation of solid organs, which is something that hasn't realistically been done to a medically practical extent yet. The two things that it achieves, first of all, are that you can use much less cryoprotectant. You need a cryoprotectant in cryopreservation of solid organs because otherwise the organs crystallize. You get the formation of ice crystals, and that completely destroys the organ. So you've got to stop that from happening. And there is an elaborate cocktail of cryoprotectants that was developed maybe 25 years ago that does this, that completely prevents crystallization. But so basically the organ becomes solid, but it becomes an amorphous solid, a glass. So this is called vitrification, right? And that's fine, except that these cryoprotectants, they're a little bit toxic. Only a little bit, but you have to use humongous concentrations of them, so it's bad. So it turns out that if you cool faster, you can get away with a lower concentration of cryoprotectant. Plus, of course, there's less time for the cryoprotectant to be toxic before everything stops because it's too cold, right? I mean, chemistry stops. So this is a huge advantage. And the other advantage is cracking. So normally when you freeze or vitrify an organ, you've got problems of thermal stresses because of things not being quite uniform in terms of the rate of cooling or perhaps in the composition of the organ. And so you get fractures, large-scale fractures. Now that doesn't happen when you're doing persiflation, essentially because fractures, they start from somewhere and then they propagate, and fractures just don't propagate through bubbles. They don't propagate through gas. So when they hit a capillary, which they hit very, very soon, then they stop, and you don't get cracks. So it's fantastically powerful. But we're very much still at the proof of concept stage. So even though this is a company, we funded it from LEV Foundation purely philanthropically, just seed funded, and we're very hopeful that there will be proof of concept sufficient to get proper investment very soon.
What would be the source of the organs? So these are like donated organs that you're saving for some later period.
Yes, precisely. The idea here is to address the organ donation shortage. Of course, as we know, masses and masses of people die on waiting lists all over the world simply because people with a sufficiently compatible immune system didn't die at a convenient time nearby. It has to be nearby because organs that have not been cryopreserved decay within hours after they've been taken out of the body, and that's just not long enough to get an organ from one side of the planet to another. So yeah, it's appalling. And if you could simply cryopreserve these things, they would last forever. So you can just make huge banks of these things, immune matched, same as you would for for blood donations, and that's definitely the goal.
So I did look at the Alliance for Longevity Initiative, and whenever we talk to people, it's like they say, "Well, the FDA will never approve that," and it's like it just seems such a roadblock, and that seems like one of the most important, actually, one of the most important things that you're doing.
Well, I think it's pretty important, yeah. I mean, the FDA, at the end of the day, what they're doing is they're simply implementing the law. People give them a really hard rap, but it's not their fault.
Right.
And so we have to say, okay, why is the law what the law is? And that's basically a combination of politicians having only one real goal in life, which is to get re-elected, namely, and therefore they never lead public opinion, they're always following public opinion, which means we have to affect public opinion. And the second one, of course, is just lack of education, lack of knowledge about a particular issue, which is something that we're trying to fix.
You're also doing some education for like entrepreneurs or young scientists.
Yes, very much so. So actually, the reason I didn't mention it earlier is because that was so successful initially that they don't need our money anymore. They're very much self-sufficient now. But yes, the thing you're talking about is called less death, spelled as one word. It is an idea that came out of a conversation I was having about 18 months ago with one of my earliest proteges, a guy named Mark Hammerleinen. He'd done his early doctoral work funded by us, and he moved on and did some various entrepreneurial things, done quite well. Wanted to really get back into the longevity game and make an impact. And so we came up with the idea that money is less of a barrier now. It's certainly not gone away, but it's less of a barrier now to the rate of progress than it used to be. And the thing that's kind of overtaken it as the number one rate limiter is lack of talent. The fact that there simply aren't enough people in the field with the right kinds of spectrum of talents and skills to take the field forward quickly. And the single most important example of that is lack of entrepreneurial talent. You've got masses of professors out there who've got great ideas that may have very significant relevance to the longevity crusade, and they can't get grants because grants are hard to get because there's never enough money. And so nothing happens. And then they think, I know what, there's investors now, there's a private sector in this field, I'll start a company and I'll get people to invest. And they start the company and they talk to investors, and the investors immediately recognize that this professor doesn't know how to run a company to save his life, so they don't write the check. And so the goal is to fix that by identifying people who do have an entrepreneurial track record and who can partner with the professor, and maybe the entrepreneur has some biology training, but the main thing is they know how to talk the language of business. And so as a partnership, they've become a much more attractive value proposition to a typical investor. And I've been able to to do this pairing up of people a few times over the years. So that's all great up to a point, but of course it doesn't really scale if it's just me doing my best when people come to me. So the idea of Less Death was to scale that up, to have a retreat that where maybe a dozen of the top people in the field would come along and give lectures and tutorials, but the audience would be maybe 50 people, not necessarily just entrepreneurs, but people who had really only two qualifications. Number one, they were really keen to get involved and have an impact in the longevity mission. And number two, they didn't know how. In other words, they had skills, but they didn't really have the right connections or understanding of how to apply those skills. And the idea was to fix that. So I seed funded that, the first Less Death retreat, which happened last summer. And it was a blowout success. Literally 2/3 of the participants wrote in a survey 2 weeks after the event, that they'd already created contacts and partnerships and alliances that were going to that they were going to dedicate their time to. So that's just you couldn't write it down, you couldn't make it up. It's just amazing. And so that's definitely running at full steam now. They had their second iteration of this just last week. They're going to do 3 more this year. So it's fantastic. Yeah.